the stillness of the desert, a man's name echoes through the ages. Joshua, a man whose victories still shake the very foundations of history. But what if I told you that the true story of Joshua is not just about armies and battles? What if the greatest conquest he achieved was hidden in the silence of the desert and the power of his faith? For 40 years, the desert tested him. It burned away the weak and forged him into something more than a warrior. A man who defied the odds, who conquered not just nations but the deepest fears of the human heart. What if I told you that Joshua's greatest victory was a victory over doubt itself? What if the walls of Jericho weren't the only walls he brought down? What if the walls of history, of secrecy, of belief itself were crumbling right before your eyes? The story you're about to hear has been buried in the sands of time, locked away in the pages of the Bible, but today we unlock it. The incredible unseen journey of Joshua, the man who dared to believe. Step with me into the desert and witness the rise of Joshua, a warrior who would lead a people to a promise, and beyond it, a mystery. In a time when courage was rarer than gold, one man stood apart. Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim was not born a leader, he was forged into one. The desert was harsh, a furnace that burned away weakness and left only the strong. It was in this desolate place where others would crumble that Joshua found his calling. A land of endless sand of sun that scorched the earth beneath his feet and the constant howl of the wind. Yet amidst all this, Joshua stood still, unwavering. His sword was sharp, yes, but sharper still was his faith. The kind of faith that could move mountains, the kind of faith that could stare down the abyss and see the hand of God in every moment. It wasn't just the battlefields where Joshua excelled, it was his mind. A battlefield of a different kind, the kind where victory is won long before the first sword is drawn. In the desert, he learned that victory doesn't begin on the battlefield, it begins in the mind. While others saw chaos, Joshua saw patterns. He saw the fingerprints of God on every step, every strategy, every victory. The desert was more than a test of strength. It was a test of his very soul. And Joshua knew that God was preparing him, refining him like gold in the fire. He was learning that to lead Israel, he must first lead himself. He had to conquer his own doubts, his own fears, before he could ever conquer Canaan. For 40 years, Joshua watched Moses, the great leader, the man who spoke to God face to face. And as he did, a question burned deep inside of him. Could that same fire dwell within me? Could the same God who parted the Red Sea, who rained manna from heaven, use someone like him, an ordinary man from Ephraim? Could God take a man raised in the dust of the desert and make him the very instrument of his will? The desert had a way of stripping away pretense, revealing the true nature of a man. And Joshua was being shaped not just by the heat of the sun, but by the very hand of God himself. While others quaked in fear at the prospect of battle, Joshua's confidence came from something greater than strength. Many warriors relied on their muscle, their weapons, their armies, but Joshua relied on something far more potent, a God who never lost a battle. And as the years passed, Joshua learned what it truly meant to trust. It wasn't just about leading a people into battle. It was about leading them through faith, through trust in God's timing, and in the knowledge that every victory, every challenge, every step was already in the hands of the Almighty. But there were moments when the weight of the desert, the weight of his calling, felt like too much to bear. Joshua wasn't immune to doubt. He wasn't immune to fear. There were nights when the wind howled through the camp and the stars seemed far away distant, like God himself had forgotten. In those moments, Joshua would fall to his knees, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. He would call on the Lord, and the answer would always come. The answer, though, was never a loud, booming voice. It was always something quieter, more profound, a whisper deep in his soul, "I am with you." It wasn't just a reassurance, it was a declaration. God had not abandoned him. God was shaping him. Every trial, every moment of fear was a step towards something greater. Joshua could feel it, the fire of God kindling inside of him. His faith was growing stronger, deeper, and in the silence of those desert nights, Joshua began to understand something that would shape the very heart of his leadership. Obedience to God's will was the true path to victory. Not the sword, not the army, but obedience. Joshua had seen his people Israel constantly wavering, constantly questioning. He had seen them forget the promises of God and fall into the wilderness of doubt. And yet he had seen the faithfulness of God time and time again. If only they would trust as he had learned to trust. Joshua knew what he was being prepared for, not just as a warrior, but as a leader of faith. The day would come when he would lead his people into the land promised to them, and he would need to be more than a soldier. He would need to be a man of unshakable trust in God, a man who saw beyond the giants, beyond the walls, beyond the storms. He would need to be a man who knew that faith, not might, would win the war. And as the days passed, Joshua's moment was drawing near. The desert had done its work. The fire had refined him, and soon he would no longer be a mere follower of Moses. He would be the leader of Israel. He would be the one to take them into the promised land. But first there was one more test, a test that would shape the very destiny of a nation. And so Joshua prepared for the next chapter of his journey. The desert had been his crucible. Now the world awaited. But what kind of man would he be, and would he rise to the challenge that lay ahead? The wilderness is a cruel teacher. No walls, no comfort, no escape. It strips a man bare until all that remains is what cannot be taken, his faith. For Israel, it was a place of wandering. For Joshua, it was a place of awakening. Each sunrise burned hotter than the last, and each night stretched longer than the one before. The sand swallowed footprints by morning, as if the desert itself wished to erase their journey. But through the endless horizon of dust and silence, Joshua saw something others did not. The wilderness was not a punishment, it was preparation. He saw thousands fall to doubt, rebellion, and fear. He watched entire families turn against the very God who had freed them from Egypt. They grumbled for water, cursed the manna, and questioned Moses at every step. The cries of the unfaithful echoed through the camp. Voices that once sang songs of deliverance now whispered rebellion. Yet when others cursed the sand, Joshua built altars on it. When despair whispered, "You're alone," he whispered back, "The Lord is with us." While the people complained about what they lacked, Joshua thanked God for what remained, his presence. He learned that survival in the desert was not about strength or strategy. It was about surrender. It was about trusting the unseen hand that guided them by cloud and by fire. And in that harsh silence, Joshua's heart began to change. His secret weapon was not the sword, it was silence and prayer. When others shouted, he listened. When others feared, he waited. Because in the wilderness, God speaks not through thunder, but through whispers. Joshua realized that every delay from God is not denial, it is divine design. Each passing day, each unanswered question was shaping him into a vessel ready for purpose. The desert was not delaying his destiny, it was defining it. There were days when Joshua's faith was tested to the breaking point, when the people rose up against Moses, when serpents struck the camp, when the promise felt like a lie. But through every trial, Joshua kept his eyes fixed beyond the dunes, toward the unseen horizon. He remembered the words spoken long ago, "I will bring you into a land flowing with milk and honey." Even when the sand burned his feet, he walked as if that promise were already his. How many deserts must we cross before we realize the dry places are where we grow the most? For it is only in the emptiness that we learn what truly fills us. Only when everything else is stripped away that we can see what was holding us all along. Joshua discovered that the wilderness, though lifeless to the eye, was alive with purpose. Every thorn, every grain of dust, every trial, all conspired to teach him one truth. Faith is not forged in comfort, but in chaos. And while others died with bitterness in their mouths, Joshua lived with belief in his heart. He began to understand that God was not just leading his people through the desert. He was leading the desert through them, purging their fear, reshaping their souls. What looked like a punishment was actually a purification. The fire that surrounded them was the same fire that refined them, and Joshua, in the midst of it, began to shine. He no longer followed the cloud out of fear, but walked beneath it with conviction. The desert no longer felt endless, it felt sacred, because somewhere beyond this wilderness, he knew the promise still waited. The wilderness will always test what you claim to believe. It asks one question again and again. Do you still trust me? Joshua's answer was simple. Yes, Lord, even here. He learned that real faith is not proven when the walls fall or when the waters part. Real faith is proven when nothing happens, and you still believe. The wilderness was not the end of Israel's story. It was the rehearsal for their redemption. And Joshua, the silent warrior, was being prepared for something the world had never seen before. Soon the desert would no longer contain him. Soon he would face giants, walls, and kingdoms. But before he could conquer Canaan, he had to conquer himself. He had to master the unseen battles, the ones fought in the soul, not on the field. And then one day the call came, a new mission, a test of vision that would divide a nation. 12 men would be chosen, only 2 would see through the eyes of faith, and Joshua was one of them. The desert journey had hardened Joshua's hands and humbled his heart, but nothing could prepare him for what was coming next. The moment that would test not his strength, but his sight. 40 years after the Exodus, the people of Israel stood at the edge of promise. The land of Canaan stretched before them, fertile, rich, mysterious. The air itself carried a weight of destiny. It was the fulfillment of everything they had endured, and yet it was also the beginning of their greatest fear. Moses gathered 12 men, 1 from each tribe, to explore the land God had promised. Joshua was among them, young, yet wise, disciplined by the wilderness. Caleb, fierce and faithful, walked by his side. Together they would step into enemy territory, not merely to see, but to believe. For 40 days the spies moved in silence across the hills of Canaan. They passed vineyards heavy with grapes, rivers gleaming like veins of silver, and cities fortified with walls so high they seemed to pierce the heavens. They saw the children of Anak giants, descendants of an ancient line, men whose presence alone made soldiers tremble. The land was everything God had promised, and yet it terrified them, because between promise and possession stood a single truth: faith always demands courage. As they returned to camp, the air was tense. The 12 carried a cluster of grapes so large it had to be borne on a pole between 2 men, proof of abundance. The people gathered in awe, waiting to hear the report. 10 of the spies spoke first, their voices trembling. The land indeed flows with milk and honey, they said, but the people there are strong. Their cities are fortified and very large. We saw giants there, and in our own sight we were like grasshoppers. Their words spread like poison through the camp. Hope turned to panic. Courage dissolved into fear. The people who had witnessed plagues in Egypt, who had walked through parted seas, now trembled at the sight of men. But then Joshua stepped forward, his eyes burning with conviction. If the Lord delights in us, he declared, he will bring us into this land and give it to us. The crowd fell silent. His words split the nation in 2 between faith and fear, trust and terror. Joshua and Caleb stood against thousands, shouting not in arrogance, but in faith. Do not rebel against the Lord. Do not be afraid of the people of this land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. But faith is often drowned by fear. The people screamed in fury. Stones were raised against them, and in that moment lightning tore across the sky. The glory of the Lord descended upon the tabernacle, silencing the madness. Then came the verdict. Because of their unbelief, the generation that left Egypt would not enter the promised land. They would wander for 40 more years until every adult who doubted was gone. Only Joshua and Caleb would live to see the promise fulfilled. A nation had failed its test of vision. They saw giants and forgot their God. Joshua learned that day that sight can deceive, but faith never lies. He realized that what destroys nations is not the strength of their enemies, it's the weakness of their hearts. Sometimes the real giants aren't out there. They live inside us: fear, doubt, complacency. And like the Israelites, we feed them every time we trust our eyes more than God's word. Joshua's courage was not born in that moment, it was revealed in it. He saw what others couldn't because he looked through the lens of trust, not logic. To him, the giants were not threats. They were opportunities for God to prove his power once more. That day changed him forever. He saw what faithlessness costs an entire generation buried in sand. and he understood something profound. The greater the promise, the greater the test. Fear can keep you alive, but it can also keep you from living. Joshua chose something different. He chose faith over fear, obedience over safety, promise over comfort. That night, as the camp slept under the cold desert stars, Joshua watched the horizon. He could almost see Canaan from where he stood, close enough to touch, yet still out of reach. He whispered a prayer only God could hear. Teach me to see as you see, Lord. Teach me to trust when others tremble. From that night forward, Joshua was no longer just a soldier. He was a visionary, a man who understood that faith is not about seeing the way, it's about walking even when you can't. But his time had not yet come. The wilderness still had lessons to teach, and the leader he would become was still being refined. For when Moses' voice would one day fall silent, Joshua's would rise carrying the same fire, the same covenant, and the same unshakable command: be strong and courageous. And that command was about to be tested in ways no man had ever faced before. The old prophet was fading, and with him an era. Moses, the voice that thundered on Sinai and trembled in the tent of meeting, now spoke softly, each word weighted like stone. Israel gathered in a hush that felt like the pause between heartbeats. And there, before tribes and elders, before memory and promise, he placed his hands upon Joshua. The air seemed to tighten as if breath itself waited. What passed between them was not merely touch, but a current, a charge, a mantle of unseen fire. A courage that did not come from men moved into the chest of a single man. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you, came the divine reply from a presence older than the mountains. It was not a slogan. It was a covenant of presence. Leadership is not inherited. It is entrusted. Joshua's rise was not political. It was prophetic. A summons issued in eternity, spoken now into time. Wave after wave of memory crashed over him. He had watched Moses defy empires and split seas. He had seen manna fall where no harvest grew and water break from rock like a wounded star. And yet now the weight was his. Imagine standing in Moses' shadow, knowing the people loved him more than they knew you, and yet being called to lead them farther than he ever could. That is not ambition. That is destiny mixed with terror. Be strong and courageous. The words did not drift like poetry. They struck like a hammer shaping metal. Be strong when the people tremble. Be courageous when the path is not yet visible. Strength here was not the roar of the lion, but the rootedness of the cedar. Courage was not blindness to danger. It was obedience despite it. Joshua's first command was not to map battle lines, but to guard the book, the instruction given through Moses. Do not let it depart from your mouth. Meditate day and night. The warrior's edge would not only be iron, it would be scripture set like flint in his mind. Strategy would rise from revelation. Tactics would flow from trust. This was the hidden mathematics of victory, faith multiplied by obedience, carried through time by remembrance. The people watched, weighing him with their eyes. Could the assistant become the leader? Could the student become the voice? The tribes were not tame. They were multitudes with memories of Egypt and habits from the wilderness. Joshua felt the press of their expectations, the murmur of their doubts, the ache of their fatigue. Yet beneath that noise ran a deeper river, the promise. I will give you every place the sole of your foot treads, not a fantasy, not a fable, but a future written before foundations. He recalled the day the spies returned, and fear drowned faith. He remembered stones lifted to kill and glory descending to defend. He had learned this law of the soul: sight without trust turns giants into gods. Trust without sight turns deserts into doorways. Now the doorway stood open, and he would have to walk first. There were whispers of the Anakim, of fortified cities and iron chariots, of walls that laughed at ladders. Joshua did not argue against their height. He argued for God's nearness. If presence goes before us, then proportions change. The wall is still tall, but God is taller. This was not bravado. It was theology applied to terrain. Night fell, and he stood at the edge of camp, listening to the slow breathing of a nation. Somewhere beyond, the Jordan swelled with flood. Beyond that, Jericho waited in its pride. He spoke into the dark, not to stir himself, but to settle himself. As you were with Moses, be with me. Let my courage be the echo of your promise and my command the servant of your word. A wind moved through the tents like a turning page. The season had changed. Tomorrow would not be like yesterday because the voice on Sinai had not retired. He had reassigned. The mantle did not end with Moses. It traveled living, potent, demanding. Leadership, Joshua discovered, is a wilderness of its own, but it is a wilderness with a pillar of cloud, a path lit by command, and a covenant that does not fail. He would step forward not as the giant among men, but as the man beneath God, and that would be enough. At dawn, the instructions would come like flint against steel. Consecrate yourselves. Tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. The desert had shaped the man. Now the river would reveal the leader, and the river was already roaring. The mantle moment. There comes a time when one story lays down its pen and another hand lifts it, when the weight you feared becomes the weight you were made to carry. If you sense a mantle resting upon you, a family to lead, a purpose to defend, a promise to steward, speak it aloud. Not as confession, but as declaration. This is your Jordan. Step forward and let presence make a path. Next, the waters will test the word, the crossing of the Jordan, faith in motion, promise in flood. The river raged, the people trembled, and Joshua, newly anointed, still carrying the scent of Moses' mantle, faced his first impossible test. How do you cross a flooded river with a nation behind you? Before him, the Jordan roared like a living creature swollen with spring rain devouring its banks. Behind him, 2 million hearts pounded with the same question. Has God brought us this far to let us drown now? Joshua stood silent for a long moment. Then, with a voice steady as the dawn, he spoke, "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." The night before the crossing was heavy with tension. The moon hung low, a pale witness to restless campfires. Men sharpened weapons, though no war awaited. Women hushed children who sensed the unease in their mothers' eyes. Yet in the midst of uncertainty, Joshua prayed, not for the waters to part, but for the people to believe. At dawn, the Ark of the Covenant was lifted, a chest of gold, radiant under the morning light, symbol of the divine presence that had led them from slavery to freedom. Joshua gave a single order: when you see the ark move, follow it. For you have not passed this way before. The priests stepped forward, feet sinking into the muddy edge. The current clawed at their robes, violent and cold. But the moment the soles of their feet touched the water's edge, the river stopped. The sound changed first. The roar dulled into silence. Then came the sight. The Jordan froze mid-flow as though time itself bowed before obedience. Upstream, the waters rose into a wall, a shimmering tower of liquid crystal, while downstream, the riverbed turned dry beneath the priests' feet. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some fell to their knees, others wept. The same God who split the Red Sea for Moses had now parted the Jordan for Joshua. A divine echo affirming the covenant had passed to new hands. A new era had begun. Joshua did not rush across. He knew miracles are not meant to be consumed in haste. He commanded 12 men, one from each tribe, to enter the river and lift 12 stones from the depths. They stacked them on the western shore, heavy, sacred, and glistening from the river's touch. These stones, Joshua said, will stand as a memorial. When your children ask, what do these stones mean? You will tell them that the waters of the Jordan stopped before the ark of the Lord. He was building not a monument of pride, but a monument of memory. Faith leaves footprints even in the river. Every miracle must be remembered, or it will be forgotten in the next storm. Every generation must be told, or they will think the wilderness was the end of the story. The priests remained standing in the middle of the dry river until every soul had crossed. Old men leaning on staffs, young soldiers gripping spears, mothers cradling infants who would one day be born in the promised land. All of them walked between walls of invisible grace, a highway carved by obedience. And when the last foot crossed, Joshua gave the order, "Come up from the Jordan." The priests stepped onto the far bank, and at that moment the waters returned. The river surged back into place as if it had never stopped. The miracle ended, but its meaning remained. It was not the water that obeyed Joshua. It was creation responding to its creator. For when a people walk in faith, even the elements remember their maker. That day the God of Moses became the God of Joshua, not by succession, but by revelation. He was proving a truth that would echo through eternity. Faith in action transforms the impossible into the inevitable. The people crossed over not just into new land, but into new identity. No longer wanderers, they were heirs. No longer witnesses of miracles, they had become participants in them. And on that riverbank, as the sun broke through the clouds, Joshua looked back at the stones, 12 silent sentinels gleaming in the light, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. He knew this was only the beginning. The river was behind them, but ahead stood something even greater, a fortress called Jericho, a city of walls that defied the sky. The Jordan had taught them that God could move water. Jericho would teach them that he could move stone, because sometimes faith must not only walk, it must shout. And when it does, even the strongest walls must fall. The first city to fall would be the strongest. Jericho, fortress of stone, fortress of pride. Its walls rose like mountains of arrogance, encircling the city in defiance of heaven. No gate had ever been breached. No army had ever dared to challenge it. Joshua stood before those colossal walls, silent, his eyes lifted toward a promise that seemed to mock him. No catapult, no siege engines, no human strategy, only a strange command from the mouth of God: march in silence for 6 days. And on the 7th day, shout. It made no sense, but faith rarely does. The soldiers exchanged glances of disbelief. The priests gripped the horns of ram's horns, their breath shallow, their eyes uncertain. Was this how a nation would conquer its first enemy? Through silence, through obedience. And yet Joshua's voice rang with quiet certainty. Do not speak a word until the day I command you to shout. For 6 days they marched one circuit each day. No sound but the crunch of sandals and the low hum of wind brushing against the Ark of the Covenant. The people of Jericho peered from their ramparts, first laughing, then whispering, then trembling. Something unseen was gathering. Faith has a sound, and in the stillness, heaven was listening. On the 7th day before dawn, Joshua rose. The air was thick, charged with something beyond comprehension. They marched not once, but 7 times around the walls. Each step was a prayer, each breath a declaration. And when the final trumpet cried out a sound like thunder, torn from eternity, Joshua shouted, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The ground trembled, the air cracked, and the walls, those impenetrable symbols of defiance, began to fall. Stone by stone, dust to dust, not by strength, not by might, but by obedience. Jericho was not just a city. It was a symbol of the barriers that stand between humanity and divine promise. The walls represented fear, pride, and every unseen force that keeps us from faith. When they fell, a new era began. This was more than conquest. It was covenant fulfilled. The God who parted seas and rivers had now broken walls, proving once again that obedience is stronger than any weapon forged by men. Israel's first victory in Canaan was not won through violence, but through surrender. The kind of surrender that trusts when reason fails. The kind of surrender that believes when sight sees nothing. Jericho's fall became a testimony not of destruction, but of divine faithfulness. For within those ruins, God's mercy still glowed. Rahab, the woman who hid the spies, and her family were spared, a sign that redemption stands even amid judgment. Joshua watched the city crumble under the blazing sun, and as the echoes faded, he realized this was not about walls of stone. It was about walls of the soul. Every generation would face their own Jericho fears, to conquer sins, to lay down promises, to claim. And the same command would remain: trust, obey, shout when it's time. That day the people saw what faith can do when it stops trying to understand and simply acts. They learned that victory is never about how loud you shout, but about how deeply you believe before you do. Faith doesn't break walls. It invites God too. From the silence of the desert to the roar of Jericho, Joshua's life had become a living sermon that courage is not born in noise, but in obedience. That every miracle begins with a step, and every step with surrender. As the dust settled and the sun dipped low, Joshua lifted his eyes toward the horizon of Canaan. Beyond Jericho lay countless battles, but the hardest one was already won. The battle to trust. The story of Joshua ends where it began, with faith in motion. Because faith doesn't stand still. It crosses rivers, marches around walls, and waits for the voice that says, now. And when it does, the impossible falls. Jericho may be ruins now, but its echo still lives in every heart that dares to believe when reason says retreat. For even today, the same God whispers across time, be strong, be courageous, for I am with you wherever you go.